when Angela and I, my wife, when we moved to Waco, by this time we had our first child, a baby girl. And while we were there, we got pregnant and had our second one. And then by the time I'd finished my master's degree, we were pregnant with our third one. So I had this young, growing family. And unlike some evangelicals who don't emphasize doctrine but only having a relationship with Jesus, I never saw any opposition between the importance of a personal relationship with Jesus and truth.
Oh, okay.
Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? It's the truth that sets you free. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. Don't be tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine. So I thought that part of being a follower of Jesus was embracing the truth. Didn't the Bible contain mountains of truth? Wasn't it important that we try to understand those teachings and live by them? So I thought, I've got to raise my family in the right version of the Christian faith. I've got to figure out what that is. And so I had this more evangelical mindset at this point. And so we visited a lot of different evangelical churches in Waco, Texas, all throughout our 2 years there. And it was the beginning of a very long and frustrating process in which I realized how inadequate I was to the task. How trying to live out sola scriptura, scripture alone, really just wasn't workable. And I had countless hours of conversations with friends and professors about theological issues. And I began getting these books published by evangelical publishing houses like Zondervan, InterVarsity Press. Like I call them views books, 4 views on the rapture, 2 views on women in ministry, 5 views on the miraculous gifts, where a Protestant from a different denominational background would defend his or her denomination's take on this particular doctrinal issue. And I thought, this is going to be how I'll figure out the truth. And after reading a bunch of these books, I thought, this is hopeless. I thought, this could not have been God's plan for the church. It doesn't work. I could go learn Hebrew and Greek and master the biblical languages. I could spend my entire life trying to sort this out, and I might never succeed. After all, these Protestants have been doing this for 500 years, and they're more divided now than they were at the beginning. Over time, the disagreement gets worse, not better. And so I just saw the practical unworkability of the Protestant prescription for how Christianity was supposed to work. And I thought, this couldn't have been God's plan.
I remember when I was a Presbyterian and I was going through this, and I remember that in the Westminster Confession, which would have been the foundational confession from my particular brand of Presbyterianism, it talks in there about the infallibility, the inspiration of Scripture in its original.
That's right.
And what that did was that immediately made the regular Christian kind of impotent to really know what it said. It really raised up the scholar as the bishop.
Right, exactly.
They're the experts.
Right, that's
right. So that allowed that person to get around all these other ideas because, I can read it in the Greek.
Right. And that's the way I was functioning. Instead of consulting the magisterium and the successors to the apostles, I was consulting these scholars who had that same kind of functional role.
Yeah.
And so as I'd taken some church history and theology classes, as an undergraduate, and I wasn't a professional church historian, but I realized that, the principle of sola scriptura, in addition to being not something taught in Scripture, so it kind of undermines itself, I thought maybe if it's in church history, though, maybe it's not taught in Scripture, but maybe the early Christians, maybe the fathers taught it. So I looked in history, I read some of the fathers, I didn't see sola scriptura anywhere. And I thought, oh man, if sola scriptura is right, then God allowed the church to go off the rails for 16 centuries. And I thought, how could God fail to exercise providential care for his bride, his body, for that long, and allow the church to... Didn't Jesus promise the gates of hell would not prevail against the church? And yet it seemed like it had, at least partially. And as I dipped my toes in the early church fathers, I saw a version of Christianity that was much more Catholic than it was Protestant. So as I was thinking through all these issues, the Lord's Supper, real presence or some more symbolic perspective. Well, the fathers had a real presence theology of the Eucharist. Scripture or tradition? Well, the fathers believed in Scripture and tradition. And so as I read through the Views books and looked at the fathers, I realized the fathers answered these questions and handled these problems in a much more Catholic way than they did in a much more Protestant way. And as a Protestant, now as an evangelical Protestant, not so much a Pentecostal Protestant, I did embrace the kind of Reformation idea of getting back to the faith of the early church. But this was troubling because the faith of the early church looked a lot more Catholic than it did a lot more. In fact, the Protestants, if anything, seemed to be innovators. They professed to be getting back to the faith of the early Christians, but they were innovating in ways that the early Christians would have rejected. And in fact, I realized that Protestants were actually imitating more of the early churches, the heretics that the early church had to defeat than they were imitating the early Christians themselves. It was the heretics who used the Bible against the church in the first few centuries. And so I thought, I couldn't believe it. It was surreal. And so because of the influence of Dr. Beckwith's conversion and my friends, and then seeing the practical unworkability of living the kind of sola scriptura, I was forced to start reading and seriously considering Catholicism in a very real way. I remember during this time I went to a conference at Boston College. It was on John Paul II and philosophy. Wow. This was shortly right before Dr. Beckwith reverted back to the Catholic Church. He was at the conference, and I think he may have been the only Protestant speaker at the conference. And I'd never been around so many Catholics before in my life at this conference, and I'd read Catholic writers, present and past, but to be around so many Catholic thinkers, I was just impressed. I mean, these guys, men and women, they were respected scholars. They obviously took the Christian faith seriously. And then there was a mass that closed the conference out. I think this was probably the first mass I ever attended in my life. And I saw these Catholic scholars on their knees. I saw them reciting the creed. I saw them praying and genuflecting. And I'm like, they actually believe this. They believe it. It's real to them. There's no opposition here between faith and reason, between scripture and tradition, between mind and heart. And that was attractive to me. And so I came out of that fired up about John Paul II. I wanted to learn more about this guy that I'd heard so much about at the conference. And so I went and I read Fides et Ratio. And as a young philosophical, budding, maybe one day philosopher, I was just blown away. And I thought, I don't know the head of any Protestant denomination who could produce something like this. Yeah. He seemed to be drawing from a well that was so deep and so rich theologically and spiritually. And I thought, I want to belong to a tradition that can produce people like Pope John Paul II. I saw good Protestant scholars. I saw morally virtuous Protestant people, but I really didn't see this combination that you see in the Catholic saints. As I look back over Christian history, I thought this combination of virtue, loving God with your heart, and then knowledge, loving God with your mind, I saw this over and over again in the greatest Catholic saints. And I thought this tradition is producing a caliber of disciple that I just didn't see anywhere in Protestantism, even the 500-year history of Protestantism. And so I think by the end of my Baylor days, which came in 2006, I was probably, 75, 80% converted in my head, but hadn't really gone to Mass very much. It was all mostly theoretical at this point. Catholicism seemed like maybe it's the most correct theory of Christianity, theologically speaking.
But it's hard when you had it so much as a part of your background to be anti-Catholic to just get rid of that.
That's right.
May I ask, were you sharing any of this at home?
Yeah. My wife and I talked about it, and I think we were the only. I was the only student. I wasn't the only married student, but I think I was the only student that had a wife and children. Yeah. So it was just easier for us to host all of our friends at our house. And so we often had these debates in my house. So my wife was there, and her and I talked about it.